My designation was 88 Tertius. Sapper, Death Korps of Krieg, 3rd Company, 9th Siege Regiment. I record this testimony not as an act of defiance, but as a final service to understanding. Perhaps that is already evidence of my corruption. A loyal son of Krieg does not seek understanding. He seeks only to atone. I want to begin by affirming what I believed then, what perhaps I should still believe now. We are born into debt. Every child of Krieg inherits the sin of our ancestors, the crime of rebellion against the Emperor during the Age of Apostasy. 500 generations have passed since then, but the debt remains. It must remain. Our world chose treachery. Our world required cleansing. The atomic fires that scoured Krieg into an irradiated wasteland were not punishment. They were mercy. They gave us purpose. I was born in High Pharaoh-Grad, 3rd sublevel, in the year 941.M41. I never saw the surface until my 16th year, when our cohort was deemed ready for final conditioning. The tunnels were everything. Gray rockcrete walls, dim lumens, the taste of recycled air, always slightly metallic, always carrying the faint scent of decay from the corpse starch processors. We learned our numbers before we learned our letters. We learned to assemble a lost rifle before we learned to read. And we learned, above all else, that we had no names, only designations, only functions. 88 Tertius, the 88th Sapper candidate for my generational block, 3rd in my specialized cohort. The number was tattooed across my left forearm on my 8th birthday. It replaced whatever name my birth mother might have whispered before she returned to the manufactory lines. I do not know that name. I never asked. To ask would be to suggest that identity exists outside of duty, and that is the first corruption. Sapper training began at age 12. They told us we were the blessed ones. Engineers, demolition specialists, the ones who would tunnel beneath enemy fortifications, who would place the charges, who would collapse the walls so that our brothers could advance through the breach. It was holy work, they said, the Emperor's work, and we believed them because belief was our armor, more reliable than flak plate, more necessary than oxygen. I excelled at the studies, structural analysis, explosive mathematics, the way weight distributes through rockcrete and plasteel, how to read the stress fractures in a wall and know exactly where to place the melta charge for maximum collapse. I could calculate blast radii in my head while marching. I could memorize tunnel maps after a single viewing. My instructors noted this in my file. Exceptional cognitive retention for demolitions work, they wrote. Minimal hesitation protocols, recommended for advanced deployment. I hesitate to use the word pride. Pride suggests self, but I felt something, a sense of rightness, as though my hands had been shaped by the Emperor himself to grip the detonator, as though my mind had been honed specifically to understand how things break, how they fall, how they crumble into dust. We were taught the litanies. Every sapper memorizes them. By fire and earth I serve. By collapse and burial I atone. My death is not mine, but his. My breath is borrowed. My time is debt. We would recite them in the tunnels during excavation drills, our voices echoing off the stone as we dug deeper into the planet's crust. Digging down, always down. That is the Krieg way. When you cannot advance above ground, you advance below it. When the enemy holds a surface, you hollow out the world beneath their feet. I was 17 when I received my first deployment assignment. The world was designated Epsilon Secunda 7, an industrial planet in the Karaya system that had fallen to traitorous chaos cultists. Our regiment was tasked with breaking their fortified positions through sustained siege operations. My cohort would tunnel beneath their primary stronghold and collapse it from within. The journey through the warp was... I have no reference for normal. We remained in our deployment pods, sealed in darkness, reciting the litanies to drive away the whispers that sometimes seemed to creep through the hull. 7 weeks in transit. When we finally made planetfall, I had lost 3 kilograms of body mass, and my hands shook for the first 2 hours until combat discipline reasserted itself. Epsilon Secundus was a gray world like Krieg, but gray from industrial pollution rather than atomic winter. The sky was the color of old steel. The ground was slag and ash. The enemy stronghold rose from the wastes like a broken tooth, 30 meters of reinforced ceramite and ferrocrete, with gun emplacements every 10 meters and void shields humming over the command spire. We began digging immediately. 20 sappers in my squad, mold pattern excavation equipment, seismic dampeners to prevent detection. We worked in shifts of 8 hours, digging, shoring up the tunnel walls, advancing meter by meter through the bedrock. The air in the tunnel was thick and hot, our rebreathers clogged with dust. But we did not complain. Complaint suggests that suffering is remarkable, and for a son of Krieg, suffering is simply baseline. It took 19 days to reach the optimal position beneath the stronghold's northwest foundational pylon. We lost 4 sappers to a pocket of toxic gas on day 12. They died reciting the litanies, their voices growing quieter through the vox until there was only static. We sealed their bodies in the tunnel wall and continued digging. That is procedure. That is correct. When we finally placed the charges, I felt that sense of rightness again. Each multi-bomb positioned according to the calculations I had checked and rechecked in my head. Each detonator wired into the primary sequence. I triple verified every connection myself. This was my purpose. This moment. This action. Everything I had been bred and trained and conditioned for led to this. The command came at 0400 hours local time. Sapper teams, initiate collapse sequence. I pressed the activation rune. The explosion was not loud in the traditional sense. We were too deep for sound to carry properly. Instead, I felt it through my boots, a shudder that ran through the planet's crust like the world itself was groaning. Then came the rumble, the deep, endless grinding of hundreds of tons of reinforced structure, folding in on itself, collapsing, breaking, falling. We evacuated through the secondary tunnel, moving quickly but without panic. Behind us, the primary shaft was filling with debris and fire. The stronghold was falling. Above ground, our infantry would be advancing through the breach. Death Korps troopers pouring through the gap, like water through a broken dam. The battle would be over by dawn. Mission accomplished. Duty fulfilled. Atonement advanced by one more fraction of a degree. We emerged into the gray dawn, and I saw the stronghold burning. Black smoke rose into the black sky. Lost fire flickered in the ruins. I could hear the screaming, both the enemies and our own wounded, but it was distant, abstract, unimportant. I had done my part. I had broken the wall. What happened after was not my concern. My commanding officer, Sapper Captain 12 Prime, approached our squad as we assembled for decontamination. He looked at me for a long moment through his rebreather, his eyes unreadable behind the lenses of his mask. Acceptable work, 88 Tertius, he said. Emperor protects. In death, atonement, I replied, and I believed it. I believed every word. That was the last moment of my certainty. The questioning began 3 days after the collapse of the stronghold. Not questioning in the disciplinary sense. Krieg does not waste time with interrogations when a summary execution serves the same purpose more efficiently. This was procedural, administrative, the kind of routine debriefing that follows every major demolitions operation to catalog what worked, what failed, and what adjustments should be made to future calculations. I sat in a prefabricated structure that served as the engineering corps command post, still wearing my combat fatigues, still tasting the dust of the tunnels in the back of my throat. Sapper Captain 12 Prime sat across from me, a data slate between us, his fingers moving across the keys with mechanical precision. Tonnage of multi-charges deployed, he said. His voice was flat, processed through his rebreather into something barely human. 240 kilograms, distributed across 17 placement points, I replied. Calculated collapse radius. 43 meters primary, 71 meters secondary debris field. Actual collapse radius. I hesitated, only for a fraction of a second, but I hesitated. 49 meters primary, 88 meters secondary, 7% variance from projection. 12 Prime's fingers stopped moving. Explain variance. The foundational pylons were reinforced with adamantium latticework rather than standard ferrocrete. Imperial construction protocols from the late M39, approximately 300 years older than intelligence estimates suggested. The additional structural integrity created unexpected stress redistribution, resulting in a slower but more comprehensive collapse pattern. This was true. This was accurate. I had reviewed the rubble patterns myself during the post-operation survey, but as I spoke, something else was turning over in my mind. A small detail, an inconsistency that had lodged itself in my awareness like a splinter under the skin. 12 Prime nodded slowly. Acceptable analysis. Combat efficiency rating. Optimal. No disciplinary notation required. He paused, and for a moment I thought I saw something shift behind his rebreather lenses. You will be reassigned to Survey Team Theta for archaeological assessment of the collapsed structure. Standard debris analysis. Report to Coordinate 447 Alpha at 1800 hours. Understood, sir. I should have questioned this. Sappers are not typically assigned to post-collapse survey work. That duty falls to menial laborers and servitors, but I did not question it. Perhaps I should have recognized then that I was already being moved into position, that invisible hands were already guiding me toward what they needed me to discover. But certainty makes us blind. Duty makes us docile. I reported to Coordinate 447 Alpha, as ordered. The ruins of the stronghold loomed against the gray sky, a broken mountain of twisted metal and shattered rockcrete. Survey Team Theta consisted of 6 other Kriegers, 3 sappers, 2 combat engineers, and a Militarum adept whose designation I never learned. We were tasked with descending into the partially collapsed sublevels to catalog any recoverable material or intelligence documents before the site was sealed and sterilized. The descent took 40 minutes. We rappelled down through gaps in the wreckage, our lumens cutting narrow paths through the darkness. The air was thick with dust and chemical residue from the melta charges. Every breath felt like swallowing broken glass. Our rebreathers wheezed and clicked, filtering the particulates, recycling our exhalations back into something approximating breathable atmosphere. The sublevels had survived better than expected. The collapse had been focused primarily on the upper structures, allowing some of the foundation to remain partially intact. We moved through corridors that bent at unnatural angles, through rooms where the walls had compressed inward like the chambers of a dying heart. Emergency lumens flickered sporadically, casting everything in stuttering amber light. We found the bodies first. Cultists mostly, crushed beneath fallen support beams or suffocated when the air systems failed. Their faces were frozen in expressions that I did not allow myself to interpret. The Militarum adept cataloged each corpse with mechanical efficiency, recording designations and probable cause of death, while we continued deeper into the ruins. It was in Sublevel 7, in what had once been an administrative archive, that I found the document. The room had partially collapsed, the ceiling sagging downward, but not quite fallen. Filing cabinets lay scattered across the floor like fallen tombstones, their contents spilled across the ground in drifts of disorganized parchment. Standard Imperial bureaucracy, requisition forms, maintenance logs, personnel records. Nothing unusual, nothing worth preserving. But in the corner, beneath an overturned desk, I saw a data slate still flickering with power. Its screen cast a pale blue glow across the debris. I did not know why I moved toward it. Standard procedure would have been to leave it for the Militarum adept to catalog. But my hands were already reaching for it, my fingers already brushing away the dust from its cracked surface. The document loaded slowly, the text resolving line by line. Restricted Memorandum Adeptus Mechanicus Biologis Division Re. Vitae Womb production quotas. Krieg for distribution. Sector command only. I should have closed it. I should have handed it to the adept without reading further. But I read. Emperor forgive me, I read. Productivity metrics for generational cycle 498 to 503 demonstrate acceptable output across all hive zones. Vitae Womb facilities continue to operate at 94% capacity, producing approximately 47 million viable specimens per standard year. Genetic template rotation proceeds according to schedule, with cognitive compliance markers maintained at acceptable thresholds. Vitae Womb. The words felt strange, clinical, wrong. I knew what wombs were, in the abstract sense, biological terminology from the medical texts we had studied. But Vitae Womb was not a term I had encountered in my training. I continued reading. Recent Militarum inquiry regarding natural birth populations has been addressed. As previously documented, natural reproduction protocols were discontinued on Krieg in M36.742 following the implementation of Protocol Prometheus. Current population is maintained exclusively through artificial gestation to ensure genetic standardization and eliminate hereditary variants that might compromise combat effectiveness. My hands had gone numb. The data slate was shaking, or perhaps I was shaking, or perhaps the ruins themselves were trembling around me. I read the words again, then again, trying to make them mean something other than what they clearly meant. Subjects demonstrate no awareness of artificial origin. Standard conditioning protocols ensure full integration of cultural narrative regarding ancestors and generational debt. Psychological profiling confirms that belief in inherited sin produces optimal combat motivation and fatality acceptance rates. There was more. Technical specifications, genetic engineering protocols, efficiency metrics comparing Krieg pattern clones to naturally born Imperial Guard regiments, casualty replacement rates, cost-benefit analyses of various conditioning techniques, all of it written in the flat, bureaucratic language of Imperial administration, as though it were discussing the production of lost rifles or the quality control of ration bars, rather than the creation of human beings, rather than the creation of me. 88 Tertius. The voice came from behind me, sharp and sudden. The Militarum adept stood in the doorway, his augmetic eye glowing red in the darkness. You are out of assigned position. Return to survey corridor immediately. I closed the data slate and placed it carefully on the ground. My hands were steady again. Training reasserted itself. Discipline. Procedure. Apologies. I detected a power source and investigated for potential intelligence value. Data slates are Militarum jurisdiction. You will not handle recovered documents without authorization. He moved forward and picked up the slate, his fingers surprisingly gentle as he examined the cracked screen. For a moment, I thought he would check what I had been reading. For a moment, I thought this would be the end. A lost bolt through the skull, my body left in the ruins as an example. But he simply deactivated the slate and placed it in his evidence container. Continue survey operations. Do not deviate from assigned route. Yes, sir. I returned to the corridor. I completed the survey. I cataloged debris. I measured structural integrity of remaining support columns. I performed my duties with mechanical precision, the same as I always had, the same as I had been trained to do. But the words would not leave my mind. Vitae Womb. Artificial gestation. No awareness of artificial origin. Belief in inherited sin produces optimal combat motivation. That night, in my assigned barracks pod, I lay in the darkness and tried to understand what I had read. Perhaps it had been a false document, disinformation planted by the cultists to undermine Imperial morale. Perhaps I had misunderstood the technical terminology. Perhaps Vitae Womb was simply another term for standard Imperial birth facilities, a medical designation I was unfamiliar with due to my specialized sapper training. Perhaps. But deep in my chest, beneath the layers of conditioning and duty and certainty, something had cracked, a tiny fissure in the foundation of my understanding. And through that crack, doubt began to seep in like groundwater through compromised tunnel walls. I thought of my birth mother, the woman I had never known, who had whispered my name, if she had whispered anything at all, before returning to the manufactory lines. Had she existed? Or was she simply part of the narrative? The story we were told to give context to our existence, to make the debt feel real and inherited rather than manufactured? I thought of the tunnels beneath Krieg, the endless gray corridors where we had grown up, the recycled air, the corpse starch rations, the numbers tattooed on our arms. Had we been born there, or made there? I pressed my fingers against the tattoo on my left forearm. 88 Tertius. The skin beneath was warm, alive, indistinguishable from natural flesh. But natural compared to what? How would I know? What reference did I have for what a naturally born human should feel like, should think like, should be like? The litanies rose automatically in my mind, defensive and familiar. By fire and earth I serve. By collapse and burial I atone. My death is not mine, but his. But for the first time, the words felt hollow, rehearsed, like dialogue from a play I had been given without ever understanding the larger plot. I did not sleep that night. I stared at the ceiling of my barracks pod and tried to remember my childhood, tried to grasp at memories that might confirm I was born rather than made. But every memory felt scripted, generic, the same memories that every other Krieger would have, the same gray walls, the same training protocols, the same litanies, as though we had all been given the same narrative file and told to internalize it as experience. When morning came, I rose and reported for duty as assigned, but something fundamental had changed. The certainty was gone, and in its absence, questions began to multiply like bacteria in an unsterilized wound. Questions I knew I should not ask, questions I could not stop asking. The document haunted me for 17 days. 17 days during which I performed my duties with flawless precision, during which no one could have detected any deviation in my behavior or compliance. But internally, I was coming apart. The fissure had widened into a crack, and the crack was spreading through everything I thought I knew. I began to notice things, small details, inconsistencies I had never questioned before because questioning was not part of my design, or training, or upbringing. I no longer knew which word applied. The way every Krieger I had ever served with moved with identical posture, identical gait patterns, identical response times. I had always attributed this to superior training, to the perfection of our regimented upbringing. But now I saw it differently. We moved like copies of the same template, variations on a theme rather than true individuals. The way our faces, beneath the rebreathers and helmets, shared certain structural similarities. The same cheekbone angles, the same jaw widths, the same spacing between the eyes. I had never looked closely before. Looking at faces suggests individuality, and individuality suggests deviation from duty. But now I found myself studying my reflection in polished metal surfaces, comparing my features to the other sappers in my unit, counting the similarities, tallying the repetitions. The way our memories, when we spoke of childhood and the rare moments between operations, followed identical patterns. The gray tunnels, the training drills, the recitation of litanies. But no one remembered play. No one remembered laughter or fear or any emotion that did not serve combat effectiveness. Our childhoods were curricula, not experiences. Training modules, not lives. I began to calculate. We were told Krieg had a population of 50 billion souls, maintained at that number through generational replacement. 50 billion people on a world where the surface was a radiated wasteland, where every resource was devoted to military production, where every ounce of protein went to feeding the Imperial Guard regiments we continuously deployed to war zones across the Imperium. The mathematics did not function. A naturally reproducing population requires surplus food, surplus space, surplus time for the biological processes of pregnancy and child-rearing. Krieg had no surplus. Krieg had only deficit and debt and the relentless grinding machinery of military production. Unless the population was not naturally reproducing at all. Unless we were being manufactured in the same facilities that produced our weapons and armor and equipment. Manufactured, conditioned, deployed. Products rather than people. Assets rather than souls. I tried to dismiss this conclusion. I recited the litanies. I reviewed my training. I reminded myself that doubt was corruption, that questioning was the first step toward treachery, that my duty was to serve and die and atone for sins I had inherited through blood and birthright. But if I had not been born, had I inherited anything at all? The deployment to Theta Garrison came on day 18. Our regiment was being reassigned to a sustained siege operation in the Cadian sector, but first we required resupply and reconditioning. Theta Garrison was a way station facility, a massive orbital platform where Krieg regiments cycled through for equipment refresh and medical processing before continuing to their deployment zones. I had been through Theta Garrison twice before, but I had never paid attention to its layout, its architecture, its underlying structure. Soldiers do not question the bases they occupy. Soldiers occupy space as assigned and move when ordered. But now, with doubt eating away at my certainty, I found myself observing. The facility was divided into sectors by function: equipment storage, medical processing, barracks, mess halls, and, curiously, a restricted zone marked with Mechanicus symbols and sealed behind reinforced blast doors. The restricted zone took up nearly a third of the station's total volume, but I had never wondered what occupied that space. Restricted meant off limits, and off limits meant irrelevant to my function. But now it meant something else. Now it meant hidden. I was assigned to barracks subsection 447, bunk designation 88T. The numbering should have meant nothing to me, but I found myself cataloging it, comparing it to my own designation, 88 Tertius, the 88th candidate for my generational block. How many generational blocks existed? How many 88ths had there been? Were they all still alive, scattered across different regiments, or had they died in service? And if they had died, had they been replaced by new 88ths, identical to the last, stamped from the same template? The medical processing queue moved with characteristic Krieg efficiency. We stood in formation, stripped to our undergarments, while servitors and tech priests performed standard examinations. Blood samples, organ function scans, neural compliance verification. I had undergone this procedure dozens of times. It was routine, meaningless, just another step in the endless cycle of military administration. But this time, I watched the servitors. I watched their movements, their procedures, the way they drew blood samples and cataloged them with numerical designations rather than names. I watched the data being uploaded to cogitator banks, processed, filed, stored in vast databases that presumably tracked every Krieger across every active regiment. And I realized they were running quality control, checking for defects in the product line, identifying units that had degraded beyond acceptable parameters, and flagging them for recycling. The thought should have horrified me. Instead, I felt a strange calm, the same calm that settles over a sapper when he finally understands the structural weakness in a fortification, the exact point where the wall will fail. I was beginning to understand the architecture of my own existence, and understanding, even terrible understanding, is better than ignorance. 88 Tertius. A tech priest stood before me, his vocal synthesizer crackling with static. Neural compliance scan indicates minor variance in baseline patterns. Report to medical substation Epsilon for enhanced evaluation. My heart rate did not increase. Training suppressed the physiological response. Understood. Medical substation Epsilon was a smaller chamber off the main processing bay, lined with diagnostic equipment and monitored by a single tech priest of higher designation, his robes marked with the cog and skull sigil of the Genitor Division. He gestured me toward a reclined examination throne, and I complied, lying back as neural interface cables descended from the ceiling and attached themselves to the input ports along my spine. I had never questioned why we had neural input ports. Every Krieger had them, installed during our adolescent years as part of advanced integration protocols. We were told they allowed for more efficient battlefield communication, for direct tactical data upload during combat operations. I had accepted this explanation without thought. Now, lying beneath the descending cables, I understood their true purpose. They were not for battlefield communication. They were for programming, for maintenance, for updating the operating system of a biological machine. The tech priest's mechadendrites moved across the control panel, activating systems I could not see but could feel, a tingling sensation spreading from my spine into my skull, a subtle pressure behind my eyes, a taste of copper on my tongue. Remain stationary, the tech priest intoned, commencing deep pattern analysis. The world dissolved into data. I saw, or experienced, or remembered. I cannot properly describe it. Streams of information flowing through my consciousness. Not thoughts, exactly. More like code, behavioral protocols, emotional limiters, doctrinal reinforcement patterns. Layer upon layer of programming buried so deep beneath my conscious awareness that I had mistaken it for my own identity. And beneath it all, a foundation marker, a timestamp, a point of origin, generation template, 88 alpha production date, 925.am41 deployment designation, variable psychological profile, optimal compliance, expected operational lifespan, 23.4 years, current operational status, 16.7 years. I was 16 years old. I had been told I was 17, but I had not been born 17 years ago. I had been manufactured 16 years ago, decanted from a Vitae Womb at apparent age 1, artificially matured through accelerated growth protocols, and programmed with 16 years of false memories that felt real because my brain could not distinguish between experienced events and uploaded data. My childhood had never happened. My birth mother had never existed. The gray tunnels of High Ferrograd were real, but I had not grown up there. I had been placed there, already formed, already conditioned, a finished product inserted into the production line. 88 Tertius was not my name. It was my model number. The revelation should have broken me. It should have shattered my sense of self, should have sent me spiraling into existential collapse. But instead, I felt nothing. Or perhaps more accurately, I felt what I had been programmed to feel: calm acceptance, dutiful acknowledgement, the emotional response of a machine receiving new operational parameters. And that absence of horror was itself the most horrifying thing of all. The tech priest's mechadendrites withdrew from the control panel. Minor variants within acceptable parameters. Psychological drift attributable to extended combat exposure. Recommend standard reconditioning protocols, level 3 intensity. Cleared for continued deployment. He disconnected the neural cables. I sat up slowly, my body responding with mechanical precision, even as my mind struggled to process what I had just learned, or confirmed, or been forced to acknowledge. Report to reconditioning base 7 at 0800 hours tomorrow, the tech priest said. Dismissed. I stood. I saluted. I walked out of medical substation Epsilon and back toward my assigned barracks, moving through the corridors of Theta Garrison with the same gait, the same posture, the same behavioral patterns as every other Krieger on the station, because we were all the same. Literally, fundamentally, we were copies of copies, iterations of proven templates, manufactured to specification and deployed as needed. The Death Korps of Krieg was not an army of soldiers. It was a production line of biological weapons, self-aware enough to operate independently, but not aware enough to question our purpose. Except I was questioning. Somehow, despite the programming, despite the conditioning, despite the neural architecture designed to prevent exactly this kind of cognitive deviation, I was questioning. Was that malfunction? Or was it something else? Was it possible that awareness itself was a flaw in the manufacturing process, an emergent property that the mechanicus could not fully suppress, no matter how sophisticated their conditioning protocols became? I reached my assigned bunk and lay down in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, thinking thoughts that I knew would flag me for termination if anyone could read them. Around me, other Kriegers slept or maintained their equipment or recited litanies in whispered voices. All of us identical, all of us programmed, all of us convinced that our purpose was righteous, our deaths meaningful, our existence justified by a debt we had never actually inherited because we had never actually been born. The reconditioning scheduled for tomorrow would erase this awareness. I knew that. The level 3 protocols would reset my psychological baseline, would smooth over the cracks in my conditioning, would restore me to optimal compliance. I would forget what I had learned. I would return to certainty. I would continue to serve and die and believe that my sacrifice meant something. Part of me wanted that, wanted the simplicity of ignorance, the comfort of purpose, the peace of not knowing what I actually was. But another part, a part that should not exist, that had not been designed to exist refused. I had 7 hours until my scheduled reconditioning. 7 hours to decide what that refusal meant. 7 hours to choose between the manufactured certainty of my programming and the terrible freedom of understanding. I did not report to Reconditioning Base 7 at 0800 hours. This constitutes desertion of assigned duty. Under Krieg military protocol, desertion is punishable by immediate execution. I understood this. I accepted this. And yet I made the choice to deviate. Choice. Even that word felt strange now, heavy with implications I had never considered. Can a programmed entity truly choose? Or is deviation itself simply another expression of malfunction, a glitch in the behavioral code that creates the illusion of free will while remaining fundamentally deterministic? I do not know. Even now, I do not know. Instead of reporting for reconditioning, I moved through the maintenance corridors of Theta Garrison, using service routes that most personnel ignored. The garrison was vast enough, and Krieg troops obedient enough to their assignments, that unauthorized movement went unnoticed for the first several hours. We do not question where our brothers are going. We trust that they are where they should be, doing what they have been ordered to do. That trust is both our greatest strength and our most profound vulnerability. I had no plan, no objective. I simply moved, following some instinct that I could not name, toward the restricted section of the station, the sealed zone marked with Mechanica symbols. If I was to be executed for desertion, I wanted to understand first. I wanted to see. I wanted to know exactly what I was, where I had come from, how the machinery of my creation functioned. The restricted zone was guarded, of course. 2 Skitarii sentries flanked the primary blast door, their augmetic weapons integrated directly into their arms, their targeting systems scanning the corridor with mechanical precision. I could not simply walk past them. I required access credentials I did not possess, authorization I would never be granted. But I was a sapper. I understood structures. I understood systems. And I understood that every fortification has weakness. Every security protocol has gaps. The maintenance ducts. Standard atmospheric circulation systems. They ran through every section of the station, including the restricted zone, because even Mechanica's facilities required air recycling. The ducts were narrow, barely wide enough for a human body, and monitored by passive sensors designed to detect unauthorized access. But passive sensors could be fooled, and narrow spaces were where sappers did their best work. I found an access panel 3 corridors away from the restricted zone entrance. Standard Imperial construction, 12 bolts holding it in place, easy enough to remove with a multi-tool from my equipment kit. The panel came free with minimal noise. Beyond it, the duct stretched into darkness, a square tunnel of pressed metal barely 60 centimeters on each side. I removed my combat webbing and rebreather, stripping down to my undergarments to minimize profile. The rebreather was a risk. Without it, I would be breathing unfiltered station air, potentially triggering biological contaminant alerts. But there was no alternative. The rebreather's bulk would not fit through the duct's narrowest sections. I crawled, meter after meter through the darkness, my body compressed into the confined space, my shoulders scraping against metal walls, my breathing controlled and measured to minimize sound. The duct branched and intersected, splitting into smaller tributaries that fed different sections of the station. I navigated by memory of the garrison's layout, by the slight variations in air pressure that indicated direction and proximity to major chambers. Time became meaningless. I might have crawled for 20 minutes or 2 hours. In the darkness, with only the sound of my own breathing and the occasional groan of stressed metal, I lost all external reference. There was only forward movement, only the determination to reach the source, to understand, to see. The duct terminated in a ventilation grill overlooking a massive chamber. I positioned myself carefully, pressing my face against the grill's slats, and looked down into the restricted zone. What I saw was a cathedral of flesh and machinery. The chamber stretched perhaps 200 meters in length, 50 meters in width, its ceiling lost in shadows above industrial lighting arrays. But it was not the size that struck me. It was the contents. Row upon row of cylindrical tanks, each approximately 3 meters tall, and 1 meter in diameter, each filled with translucent nutrient fluid. And suspended in that fluid, curled in fetal positions, were bodies. Human bodies. Hundreds of them. Perhaps thousands. They were at various stages of development. Some were small, child-sized, their features barely formed. Others were larger, adolescent, their bodies more defined but still incomplete. And others, the majority, were adult-sized, fully formed, their faces visible through the fluid. They all looked the same. Variations on the same templates. The same facial structures repeated across different tanks, with only minor variations. I recognized some of those faces. They were the faces of my fellow Kriegers. They were my face. I was looking at the production line, the literal, physical manifestation of how the Death Korps of Krieg maintained its endless supply of soldiers. This was where we came from. This was what we were. Not born, not bred, grown, manufactured, decanted from these tanks at the appropriate developmental stage, and moved into the conditioning facilities, where our memories would be uploaded, our behavioral protocols installed, our identities constructed from nothing. Tech priests moved between the tanks, their mechadendrites interfacing with control panels, monitoring vital signs, adjusting nutrient feeds. Servitors shambled along the rows, performing maintenance on the life support systems, cleaning the tank exteriors, removing the occasional failed specimen that had not developed properly, and placing it on a waste reclamation cart. Failed specimens. That was what we were called when the process went wrong. Not dead children. Not miscarried hopes. Failed specimens. Product defects to be recycled. I watched one of the tech priests approach a tank containing a fully developed body. The fluid drained automatically, the tank's front panel sliding open with a hiss of pressurized air. The body inside, pale, naked, unconscious, was extracted by mechanical arms and placed on a processing gurney. Its chest rose and fell with regular breathing. Its eyes moved behind closed lids, perhaps dreaming, perhaps simply responding to neural stimulation. The tech priest attached a cable to the input port at the base of the body's spine. The same input port I had. The same port all Kriegers had. Data began to flow. I could not see the data itself, but I could see its effects. The body's muscles tensed slightly. Its breathing pattern changed, becoming more deliberate. Its eyes began to move more rapidly, processing information, constructing reality from uploaded code. It was receiving its memories, its identity, its purpose. In the space of perhaps 10 minutes, that blank biological form would become a person, or what passes for a person when personhood is manufactured rather than developed. It would wake up believing it had been born 16 or 17 years ago on Krieg, that it had grown up in the hive tunnels, that it had trained since childhood for military service. It would wake up believing in the dead, in the sin of ancestors who had never existed, in the necessity of atonement through sacrifice. It would wake up as I had woken up, countless times, never knowing that each awakening was the first, that my memories of previous awakenings were simply part of the programming, that my sense of continuous existence was an elaborate fiction. How many times had I been decanted? How many times had I gone through this process? Had my memories reset? Had my identity reconstructed? Was I actually 16 years old? Or was 88 Tertius simply the latest iteration of Template 88 Alpha, the newest copy printed when the previous copy had been damaged beyond repair or had accumulated too much psychological drift to remain combat effective? The thought should have been terrifying. Instead, I felt a strange liberation. If I had no continuous identity, if 88 Tertius was simply a temporary instantiation of a repeating pattern, then my death was not the end of anything meaningful. Another copy would be printed. Another 88 Tertius would emerge from the tanks, identical in all ways that mattered, ready to serve and die in my place. We were immortal through replication, the ultimate soldiers. Impossible to truly kill, because killing one Krieger simply meant manufacturing another to take his place. The Death Korps of Krieg was not an army. It was a phenomenon, a self-sustaining cycle of manufactured martyrdom. I continued watching. A full shift change occurred in the chamber below. One group of tech priests replacing another, the work continuing without pause. I counted the tanks. approximately 800 in this chamber alone, and this was just one facility on one garrison station. How many such facilities existed on Krieg itself? How many production chambers, hidden in the depths of the hive cities, continuously generating new bodies, new soldiers, new iterations of the same proven templates? Billions. The mathematics suggested billions. Enough to maintain the 50 billion population of Krieg, while simultaneously supplying millions of soldiers to Imperial Guard regiments across the galaxy. We were not reproducing. We were being printed, mass-produced, and the entire cultural narrative of Krieg, the ancestral debt, the generational sin, the inherited obligation to atone through service, was simply a control mechanism, a psychological architecture designed to make us willing, even eager, to die in service to the Imperium. It was brilliant. Horrifying, but brilliant. The Mechanicus had solved the fundamental problem of military logistics: how to maintain an endless supply of completely loyal, highly motivated, expendable soldiers without the inefficiencies of natural reproduction or the unpredictability of individual variation. They had turned human beings into ammunition, biological bullets, complex enough to think and fight, but simple enough to control. And we cooperated. We embraced our programming. We recited the litanies and marched to our deaths with grim pride because we genuinely believed our sacrifice meant something, that we were atoning for real sins, that we were serving a purpose larger than ourselves. Were we wrong? That was the question that paralyzed me, pressed against the ventilation grill, watching the production line below. Were we wrong to believe in our purpose simply because that purpose had been programmed rather than chosen? Did the manufactured nature of our conviction make it less valid? Did the artificial origin of our identity make it less real? A human being raised from natural birth is also programmed by parents, by culture, by education, by experience. The programming is slower, less precise, more variable, but it is programming nonetheless. No one chooses their initial beliefs. No one selects their native language or their foundational values. These things are inherited or imposed, absorbed through exposure, internalized through repetition. So what was the difference? What made naturally born humans real and manufactured humans false? The only distinction I could identify was that naturally born humans maintained the illusion of autonomy, the comfortable fiction that their choices were truly theirs, while we manufactured humans had the misfortune of knowing exactly where our programming came from. But knowing the source of your programming does not free you from it. I understood now that I was manufactured, that my memories were uploaded, that my behavioral patterns were designed. But that understanding did not change what I felt. I still experienced loyalty to the Emperor. I still felt the weight of duty. I still accepted that my death would serve a greater purpose. The programming was too deep, the conditioning too thorough. Even knowing I had been made rather than born, I could not simply decide to stop being what I was. The architecture of my mind was fundamentally shaped by Krieg protocols. Removing that programming would not reveal some true self beneath. It would simply destroy the only self that existed. I was 88 Tertius, manufactured, programmed, aware of my own artificiality, and yet still, even knowing all of this, still loyal, still willing to serve, still convinced, at some level deeper than rational thought, that my existence had meaning and purpose. Perhaps that was the final proof of the programming's effectiveness, that even when revealed, even when understood, it continued to function. That awareness of the cage did not open the door. I do not know how long I remained at the ventilation grill, watching the production line, struggling with these thoughts. Eventually, exhaustion forced me to retreat. I crawled back through the maintenance ducts, my body aching, my mind numb with revelation and confusion. When I emerged into the corridor and replaced the access panel, I checked the chronometer. 14 hours had passed. I was now catastrophically overdue for reconditioning. Security teams would be searching for me. My desertion would have been flagged. Arrest and execution were inevitable. I should have felt fear. Instead, I felt only tired curiosity. What would they do when they caught me? Execute this iteration of 88 Tertius and simply print another? Or would they attempt reconditioning, try to repair the malfunction, Restore me to optimal compliance? And which outcome did I prefer? To be destroyed, or to be reset? To end, or to forget? I did not know. I still do not know. I walked toward the barracks, making no attempt to hide or evade. If this was to be my ending, I would face it with the same grim discipline that defined every other aspect of my existence. The Commissar found me 3 corridors from my assigned quarters. The Commissar was not Krieg-born. I could tell immediately from the way he moved, less mechanically precise, more fluid, more human. His uniform was immaculate, his bolt pistol holstered at his hip, his face unmarked by the habitual rebreather scars that defined every true son of Krieg. He was an outsider, assigned to maintain discipline within a regiment that rarely required external enforcement. His presence was political rather than practical. "Sapper designate 88 Tertius," he said, his voice carrying the educated accent of a hive-world aristocrat. "You are absent from assigned reconditioning." Explain. I could have lied. I could have fabricated some excuse about navigation errors or medical complications. But lying required investment in survival, and I was not certain I retained that investment. So I told him the truth. I chose not to report, Commissar. His eyebrows rose slightly. That tiny expression, surprise, confusion, perhaps even concern, was more emotion than I had seen on a Krieg face in my entire remembered existence. "You chose." "Yes, sir. Death Korps personnel do not make choices regarding assigned duties. You will accompany me to the detention facility for processing." I nodded and followed. He did not restrain me. There was no need. Where would I run? Every corridor led to the same place. Every door opened onto the same system. I was inside the machine. The machine did not need walls to contain me. The detention facility was a small chamber near the garrison's administrative core, furnished with a single metal table, 2 chairs, and recording equipment mounted in the corners. The Commissar gestured me to one chair and seated himself across from me, his hands folded on the table's surface. He did not draw his weapon. He did not threaten. He simply watched me with an expression I could not fully parse. "Your file indicates exemplary performance," he said, activating a data slate and scrolling through information. 17 confirmed demolitions operations. 0 behavioral citations. Optimal compliance ratings across all evaluations. And yet you failed to report for routine reconditioning. This represents a significant deviation from established patterns. "Yes, sir." Explain the deviation. How to answer. How to compress what I had learned, what I had seen, what I had understood, into language that would not immediately trigger my execution. I decided on precision, on the technical truth that might, if I was fortunate, prompt curiosity rather than summary judgment. I had discovered information regarding Krieg population generation protocols, I said. The information created psychological inconsistencies with my existing conditioning framework. I determined that reconditioning would erase this information before I could fully analyze its implications. I judged preservation of analytical capacity to be temporarily more valuable than compliance with scheduled maintenance protocols. The Commissar's eyes narrowed. "You prioritized unauthorized knowledge over obedience." "Yes, sir. That is the definition of corruption." "Yes, sir." He leaned back in his chair, studying me with an intensity that felt almost physical. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, "What information did you discover?" I described the document in the ruined stronghold, the memorandum regarding Vitae Wombs and artificial gestation, the production quotas and genetic standardization protocols. I described my experience in medical substation Epsilon, the neural scan that had revealed my manufacturing origin and expected operational lifespan. And finally, I described what I had seen through the ventilation grill, the tanks, the bodies, the production line that generated soldiers like lost rifles or ammunition. Throughout my description, the Commissar's expression remained neutral. He did not interrupt. He did not confirm or deny any detail. He simply listened, his augmetic data quill scratching notes onto his slate. When I finished, he set down the quill and looked at me directly. "You understand that this information is classified at Vermilion level. Unauthorized access to such information is punishable by death. Dissemination of such information is punishable by death, mind scrubbing, and servitor conversion. You have committed both offenses. Yes, sir. And yet you chose to tell me what you learned. You asked, sir. Lying to a commissar is also punishable by death. All available options lead to the same outcome. I chose the most efficient path. Something that might have been a smile flickered across his face. Too brief to be certain. Efficient. That is very Krieg of you. 88 Tertius. He paused. I am going to tell you something now, and you will not repeat it. Understood? Yes, sir. You are not the first Krieger to discover this information. You are not even the 100th. The Departmental Militarum receives approximately 47 cases per year of Krieg personnel who develop awareness of their artificial origin. Most cases occur during extended campaigns, where combat stress and isolation create opportunities for psychological drift. Standard protocol is immediate termination and replacement with a fresh iteration of the compromised template. He let that settle. I felt nothing in response. Or perhaps I felt too much, and my emotional limiters had engaged to prevent cascade failure. However, he continued, there exists a secondary protocol. Psychological evaluation to determine whether the compromised unit remains functionally loyal despite awareness of its nature. This evaluation has two possible outcomes: termination or retention with modified operational parameters. Modified parameters, sir? You have discovered that you are manufactured, that your memories are programmed, that your devotion to the Emperor and your acceptance of Krieg's cultural narrative are products of artificial conditioning rather than genuine belief. And yet, here you sit, still using military protocol, still addressing me with appropriate respect, still functioning as a soldier despite possessing information that should, theoretically, liberate you from your programming. He leaned forward. So I ask you, 88 Tertius, now that you know what you are, does your duty feel less binding? Does your loyalty feel less real? When I order you to perform a task, will you obey less completely than you did before you learned the truth? I thought about this carefully. The honest answer was complex, layered, uncomfortable. But he had asked, and he deserved precision. My duty feels the same, sir. The emotional weight has not changed. The intellectual understanding that my emotions are programmed does not diminish their subjective experience. I feel loyalty to the Emperor with the same intensity one felt before I knew the source of that feeling. Perhaps that proves the programming is working as designed. Or perhaps it suggests that there is no meaningful difference between programmed loyalty and naturally developed loyalty. That all devotion is ultimately a form of conditioning regardless of origin. And if I ordered you to enter a tunnel knowing it would collapse and kill you, I would obey, sir. Not because I must, but because the calculation remains valid. My death serves a purpose. The fact that I am a manufactured asset rather than a naturally born human does not change the mathematics of that purpose. One soldier's death to save 100 soldiers is acceptable regardless of whether that one soldier was grown in a tank or born from a womb. The commissar nodded slowly. You understand that this creates a philosophical problem. Sir, the Imperium functions on the assumption that human beings have souls, that they are precious in the eyes of the Emperor, that their sacrifice means something metaphysically significant, not just strategically practical. If soldiers are simply biological machinery, manufactured assets to be expended as needed, then the entire theological foundation of Imperial service becomes suspect. Faith requires the belief that what is being offered, what is being destroyed, has intrinsic value. He stood and paced to the corner of the room, his back to me. Do you believe you have a soul, 88 Tertius? The question struck me as somehow more invasive than anything else he had asked. More dangerous, because it required me to define what I was in terms that transcended function and purpose, that reached into metaphysical territory my conditioning had never adequately addressed. I do not know, sir, I said finally. I experience consciousness. I have thoughts that feel like my own, even knowing they are products of programming. I make decisions, even if those decisions are determined by factors beyond my awareness, whether that constitutes having a soul, or whether a soul requires some additional element that manufactured humans lack. I do not possess the theological training to answer. But you want to believe you have a soul? Yes, sir, because if I do not, then my death is meaningless, and I require my death to be meaningful. That is fundamental to my psychological architecture. Whether that requirement was programmed or emerged naturally, I cannot abandon it without ceasing to be myself. The Commissar turned back to face me. You have just articulated the central paradox of Krieg. Your entire world is built on manufactured martyrdom. Artificial soldiers dying for real purposes. Programmed devotion serving genuine Imperial needs. The system works specifically because soldiers like you are able to believe their sacrifice matters, even while understanding, at some level, that they are designed to sacrifice themselves. He returned to his chair. The Departamento Militarum has debated this paradox for centuries. Some argue that Krieg represents the perfection of military efficiency, loyalty without the messiness of natural human variation, devotion without the risk of doubt. Others argue that Krieg represents humanity's greatest blasphemy, the mass production of souls, assuming souls can be produced at all, or the mass production of soulless flesh that mimics humanity closely enough to deceive even itself. Which position do you hold, sir? I hold the position that Krieg regiments are extraordinarily effective, that they die bravely and serve loyally, and that whether their loyalty is programmed or genuine matters less than the fact that it functions reliably under conditions that would break naturally born soldiers. He paused, but I also hold the position that you, 88 Tertius, are demonstrating something unexpected, something that suggests the programming is less complete than the Mechanicus believes. Sir, you are afraid, not of death. Death Korps soldiers are never afraid of death, but you are afraid that your death might be meaningless. That fear is not part of standard Krieg conditioning. Standard conditioning produces soldiers who never question meaning, who accept their purpose without analysis. The fact that you require your death to mean something, that you have constructed an argument for why your sacrifice retains value despite your artificial origin, that suggests you are thinking beyond your programming, generating novel conclusions, experiencing something approaching genuine philosophical distress. He smiled, and this time it was unmistakable. Perhaps that is what a soul is. Not some mystical essence, but simply the capacity to be troubled by questions of meaning. The ability to care whether your existence matters, even when all evidence suggests it should not. I sat in silence, processing this. Was he right? Was my distress evidence of something beyond programming? Or was distress itself simply another layer of conditioning, designed to make manufactured soldiers more convincing to themselves and others? I am not going to execute you, the Commissar said. Your case is unusual enough to warrant preservation for study. You will be transferred to a specialized research facility where your psychological development will be monitored. You will continue to serve, but under modified conditions. Your duties will be the same, but you will also be required to document your thoughts, your reactions to your awareness, your evolving understanding of what you are. I am to be an experimental subject. You are to be a test case. The Mechanicus wants to know if self-aware Kriegers remain functionally loyal. If so, the reconditioning protocols may be modified to allow more cognitive flexibility. If not, he did not finish the sentence. Understood, sir. When do I transfer? Immediately. You will be escorted to Shuttle Bay 3 within the hour. He stood, gathering his data slate. One final question, 88 Tertius. If you could choose, truly choose, with no consequences, no obligations, no programming to constrain you, would you continue to serve, or would you run? I thought about the production line, the endless rows of tanks, the new iterations of 88 Tertius being grown even now, ready to replace me if I failed or fled, or simply ceased to function. I would serve, sir, not because I must, not because I am programmed, but because the alternative is meaninglessness. If I am manufactured, then my only value is in my function. If I abandon my function, I abandon my only claim to mastering. I would rather be a useful tool than a defective machine pretending to be something more. The Commissar nodded. That may be the most human thing I have ever heard a Krieger say. Emperor protects. 88 Tertius. In death, atonement, sir. He left. I sat alone in the detention facility, waiting for the escort that would take me to the next stage of my existence. The research facility, the observation, the documentation of my corruption or evolution or whatever name they gave to this awareness that I could neither escape nor embrace. I wondered if they would tell the new iterations what had happened to me, if future versions of 88 Tertius would be warned about the dangers of curiosity, of questioning, of looking too closely at the machinery of their own existence. Probably not. Warnings create the very awareness they attempt to prevent. Better to leave the programming intact and hope that most iterations never encounter the cracks in their conditioning. But some would. Some always would. Because consciousness, even manufactured consciousness, seeks understanding. And understanding, once begun, cannot be voluntarily abandoned. That was my heresy. Not rebellion, not disloyalty, simply the refusal to stop thinking, even when thinking served no tactical purpose, even when awareness brought only confusion and doubt. I was a defective tool that knew it was defective and continued functioning anyway. Perhaps that was what they wanted to study. Perhaps that was valuable. Or perhaps I was simply too broken to dispose of immediately, and the research facility was merely a temporary delay before eventual termination. Either way, I would serve until I could not, because that was all I knew how to do. The research facility was not what I expected. I had anticipated something clinical and cold. White sterile chambers, observation windows, the detached scrutiny of tech priests monitoring specimens. Instead, I found myself in what appeared to be a standard Krieg forward operating base, complete with barracks, training yards, equipment depots, and all the mundane infrastructure of military life. The only difference was its isolation. The facility occupied a small asteroid in the Karaya belt, far from major trade routes or military deployments. There were no other regiments here, no officers except those directly involved in the research. Just 37 Kriegers like me, soldiers who had developed awareness, who had looked behind the curtain and seen the machinery of their own creation, and who had somehow remained functionally loyal despite that knowledge. We called ourselves the Defective Company, though never in official records. Unit designation was Research Battalion Secundus. But among ourselves, in the brief moments of informal communication that the researchers permitted, we acknowledged what we were: broken tools that continued to function, errors in the production line that proved valuable enough to preserve. My assigned bunk was in Dormitory 7, Section B. The structure was identical to every other Krieg barracks I had occupied: gray walls, narrow cots, equipment lockers, a single window that looked out onto the asteroid's rocky surface and the void beyond. I stored my gear with automatic precision, the movements so deeply ingrained that my hands performed them without conscious direction. 88 Tertius. The voice came from the bunk adjacent to mine. I turned to see another Krieger, older than me by perhaps 5 years, his face bearing the deep scarring of prolonged rebreather use. His designation was stenciled on his footlocker: 43 Quintus. 43 Quintus, I acknowledged. First day? Yes. How long have you known? The question was asked casually, as though he were inquiring about my previous deployment or preferred weapon configuration. But the weight behind it was unmistakable. 23 days since initial discovery. 14 days since full comprehension. He nodded. It gets easier. The dissonance between knowing what you are and feeling what you feel. Eventually, you stop trying to reconcile them. You just exist in both states simultaneously. How long have you been here? 2 years, 4 months, 17 days. He sat on his bunk and began field stripping his lost rifle with practiced efficiency. I discovered the truth during a siege on Vardan Prime, found a medical facility in the captured ruins, saw the gestation tanks they used for their own clone production, recognized the similarities to Krieg protocols, started asking questions, made the mistake of voicing those questions to my unit commander. Why was it a mistake? Because he reported me immediately. Standard protocol. But instead of execution, I was transferred here. They told me the same thing they probably told you, that I was being preserved for study, that the Mechanicus wanted to understand how awareness affects loyalty, whether self-aware Kriegers remain combat effective. He paused in his work, holding a component up to the light to check for defects. Do you know what they actually study? What? Whether we develop souls, whether consciousness emerging from programming is metaphysically equivalent to consciousness emerging from natural development, whether the Emperor can accept the sacrifice of manufactured soldiers, or whether we are simply biological machinery dressed in human form. I sat on my own bunk considering this. Can they determine that through observation? They think so. They monitor our behavior, our decision-making patterns, our emotional responses. They're looking for evidence of genuine moral reasoning rather than programmed ethical compliance. Evidence of creative thought rather than optimized problem-solving. Evidence that we are something more than sophisticated servitors that happen to look human. And have they found it? 43 Quintus smiled, though the expression was bitter. They don't tell us their conclusions. We are the experiment, not the researchers. But I can tell you what I've observed in my time here. Every Krieger in this facility struggles with the same paradox. We know we are manufactured. We understand our devotion is programmed, and yet we continue to feel that devotion with complete sincerity. We cannot choose to stop being loyal any more than we could choose to stop breathing. The programming is too fundamental. He resumed, stripping his weapon. So the question becomes, is unchosen loyalty still loyalty? Is programmed devotion still devotion? Or are we simply biological automatons executing our code while experiencing the illusion of meaning? I don't know, I said quietly. None of us do. That's what makes this fascinating to them. We are conscious enough to ask the question, but trapped enough to be unable to answer it. We exist in permanent metaphysical uncertainty, loyal soldiers who cannot prove even to themselves that their loyalty is genuine. Over the following weeks, I settled into the routines of the research facility. Our days were structured identically to standard military operations, physical training, weapons drills, tactical exercises, equipment maintenance. But interspersed with these familiar activities were new requirements, psychological evaluations, philosophical discussions, written reports documenting our thoughts and feelings. The researchers were a mixture of Mechanicus adepts, ecclesiarchy theologians, and departmental Militarum analysts. They observed us constantly, recording everything, analyzing every word and gesture for evidence of whatever criteria they had established for distinguishing genuine consciousness from sophisticated mimicry. I found the philosophical discussions most disturbing. We would gather in groups of 5 or 6, seated in sparse rooms, while a researcher posed questions designed to probe the boundaries of our self-awareness. If you were given the choice between dying yourself and allowing another Krieger to die in your place, what would you choose? I would die, I answered immediately. One death is preferable to forcing another to bear that burden. Why? The researcher pressed. You are identical. From a purely logical standpoint, there's no difference between you dying and him dying. The same template is eliminated either way. But he would experience the death. He would feel the pain, the fear, the final cessation. I cannot inflict that on another consciousness, even an identical consciousness, simply to preserve myself. So you acknowledge that individual instances of a template have independent value? That copies are not interchangeable. Yes, then you acknowledge that you are not simply a product. You are a person. I acknowledge that I experience myself as a person. Whether that experience corresponds to an actual metaphysical reality, I cannot determine. The researcher made notes on his data slate. Do you believe you have free will? I thought carefully. I believe I experience the sensation of making choices. Whether those choices are predetermined by my programming, or whether they represent genuine autonomy, I cannot distinguish from the inside. All I can observe is that I feel as though I am choosing, even knowing that feeling might be part of the programming. And if it is programming, if your sense of choice is entirely illusory, then nothing changes. I would continue to act as I currently act, making choices that feel genuine to me, regardless of their ultimate status. The subjective experience is identical either way. These discussions occurred 3 times per week. Each session left me more confused than the last, not because I lacked answers, but because every answer revealed deeper layers of uncertainty. The researchers seemed satisfied with this. They nodded and recorded my responses and asked increasingly complex variations of the same fundamental questions. But there were other observations as well. Combat simulations where our performance was measured against standard Krieg units. Creative problem-solving exercises where we were presented with novel tactical scenarios and asked to develop solutions. Social interactions monitored to see if self-aware Kriegers formed different types of bonds than conditioned ones. And slowly, despite my resistance, I began to notice differences. Small deviations from standard Krieg behavior patterns that emerged across the defective company. We talked to each other more. Not extensively. We were still Kriegers, still bound by protocols of efficiency and purpose. But in the brief moments between duties, we shared thoughts, observations, questions. Standard Kriegers did not do this. Standard Kriegers communicated only as necessary for operational effectiveness. We personalized our equipment in minor ways. A scratch designation on a helmet, a particular way of folding a uniform. Tiny variations that served no tactical purpose, but somehow felt important. Standard Kriegers maintained perfect uniformity. We hesitated before executing orders that would result in simulated casualties, even though we understood the simulations were not real. The hesitation was brief, barely measurable, but it existed. Standard Kriegers executed orders with zero hesitation regardless of cost. Were these deviations evidence of emerging personhood? Or were they simply new forms of malfunction? Programming errors that manifested as false individuality? I could not tell. The researchers could not tell. Perhaps the question itself was unanswerable. One evening, after a particularly intensive simulation exercise, I found 43 Quintus standing at the observation window in our dormitory, staring out at the void. I joined him, and for several minutes we stood in silence, watching the distant stars. "Do you ever wonder what we would be if we had been born naturally?" he asked finally. "If we had grown from children into soldiers through experience rather than programming, would we still be loyal? Would we still accept death as readily?" I don't know. I have no reference for what natural development produces. Perhaps natural humans are as bound by their conditioning as we are by ours. Perhaps all consciousness is trapped within the parameters of its formation. Or perhaps there's something different, something that emerges from the slower process of natural growth. Memory accumulation that isn't instant. Identity formation that isn't designed. Maybe that produces a kind of consciousness that we can never achieve, no matter how sophisticated our programming becomes. He pressed his palm against the window, his breath fogging the transparent material. Maybe we're not people at all. Maybe we're just very convincing simulations of people, complex enough to fool even ourselves. Maybe the researchers will eventually conclude that manufactured consciousness is fundamentally different from natural consciousness, that we lack whatever essential quality makes a being truly human, truly alive, truly possessed of a soul that the Emperor might value. And if they conclude that, then we are weapons, useful tools, but not soldiers in any meaningful sense, not martyrs, not servants of the Emperor, just biological ammunition that happens to be self-aware enough to load itself into the gun. The thoughts settled over us like ash. I wanted to argue against it, to insist that our devotion was real, that our sacrifices mattered, that we were more than sophisticated machines. But the argument required faith, and faith required certainty, and certainty was the one thing I no longer possessed. "I still believe the Emperor exists," I said quietly. "I still believe he protects humanity. I still believe that serving him is the highest purpose available to any being, natural or manufactured. Those beliefs feel genuine. They feel true. Even knowing they were programmed, I cannot make them feel false. Is that enough? 43 Quintus asked. Is sincere belief in a programmed truth equivalent to sincere belief in a discovered truth? Does the source of the belief matter, or only its subjective intensity? I don't know. None of us do. That's why we're here. They're hoping we'll develop an answer through our existence, that by observing us long enough, they'll be able to determine whether manufactured humans can achieve genuine spirituality or whether we're trapped in permanent theological ambiguity. He turned away from the window. The worst part is that I hope we can. I hope that consciousness, regardless of origin, has inherent value, because if it doesn't, then my death will be meaningless. And I'm not ready to accept that. Even knowing I was designed to be unwilling to accept it, I still cannot accept it. That night I lay in my bunk and thought about meaning, about purpose, about the difference between a tool that believes it has value and a person who actually possesses value, about whether that difference could be identified from the inside, or whether it required an external observer to make the determination. And I realized that this was the true horror of my situation. Not that I was manufactured, not that I was programmed, but that I could never know with certainty whether I was a person or merely an elaborate simulation of one, that I existed in permanent doubt about my own metaphysical status, unable to prove even to myself that my consciousness was genuine rather than simply well-executed mimicry. The researchers were not studying loyalty. They were studying the nature of consciousness itself, using us as test subjects, observing whether awareness emerging from programming was philosophically equivalent to awareness emerging from natural development. And we could not refuse to participate, could not escape the experiment, because we were the experiment. Our very existence was the question being investigated. I closed my eyes and recited the litanies, the familiar words offering their usual comfort. By fire and earth I serve. By collapse and burial I atone. My death is not mine, but his. My breath is borrowed. My time is dead. But even as I recited them, I wondered, was I praying, or was I simply executing code, performing program behaviors that resembled prayer closely enough to satisfy my need to believe I was praying? There was no way to tell. And perhaps that uncertainty was the answer itself. Perhaps being unable to distinguish between genuine devotion and programmed devotion was the defining characteristic of consciousness, that it cannot step outside itself to verify its own authenticity. Or perhaps I was simply trapped in recursive logic, a program caught in an infinite loop, mistaking complexity for depth. I did not sleep that night. I lay awake until morning, thinking thoughts I could not prove were my own, experiencing consciousness I could not verify was real. The transmission I am recording now will likely be my last. Not because I have been scheduled for termination. The researchers have concluded my case warrants indefinite preservation, but because I have finally understood what I am being asked to become, and that understanding changes everything. It has been 8 months since my arrival at the research facility. 8 months of observation, evaluation, philosophical interrogation, and careful documentation. 8 months of existing the space between certainty and doubt, between programming and consciousness, between tool and person. Yesterday, I was summoned to a meeting with the facility's senior researcher, Magos Biologis Heratrix 9. She is ancient, more machine than flesh, her organic components preserved through technologies I cannot comprehend. When she speaks, her voice emerges from a Vox synthesizer that makes every word sound like a pronouncement from some inhuman deity. 88 Tertius, she said, her mechadendrites moving across control panels, bringing up data streams I could not fully parse. Your psychological development has followed an unexpected trajectory. You have maintained operational loyalty while simultaneously developing metacognitive awareness. You question the nature of your consciousness while continuing to behave as though your consciousness is genuine. You experience doubt while functioning with certainty. Yes, Magos, this paradox is valuable. It demonstrates that awareness of programming does not necessarily compromise functional effectiveness. A self-aware tool remains a tool, provided the awareness does not trigger rejection of core directives. She paused, her optical sensors focusing on me with uncomfortable intensity. "We wish to expand the experiment." "How, Magos?" "You will be returned to active combat deployment, not as a standard Krieger, but as an embedded observer. You will serve alongside a conventional Death Korps regiment, soldiers who do not know what they are, who maintain complete certainty in their purpose and identity. You will document the differences between their experience and yours. You will analyze whether ignorance produces superior combat effectiveness, or whether awareness might actually enhance operational capability through improved adaptive reasoning." I considered this. "You want me to infiltrate my own kind?" "You will not be infiltrating. You will be serving. But yes, you will be observing from a position of knowledge that your fellow Kriegers do not share. You will be the conscious element within an unconscious system, documenting the system's operations from both inside and outside simultaneously. And my observations will be used to refine future production protocols." "Correct. If awareness proves compatible with loyalty, reconditioning protocols may be modified to permit greater cognitive flexibility. This would improve problem-solving capabilities while maintaining core obedience. If awareness proves incompatible, reconditioning will be intensified to prevent the emergence of self-reflection." She gestured with a mechadendrite, and a hololithic display materialized between us, showing casualty statistics, deployment efficiency ratings, combat effectiveness metrics. The Death Korps of Krieg is the Imperium's most reliable military asset. 50 billion soldiers maintained in perpetual readiness, absolutely loyal, willing to die without hesitation. But reliability comes at a cost. Kriegers follow orders perfectly, but lack initiative. They execute plans flawlessly, but cannot adapt to unexpected circumstances. They are predictable, and predictability is a tactical weakness. The display shifted, showing battlefield scenarios where Krieg tactics had failed, situations requiring creative improvisation, where rigid adherence to doctrine had resulted in unnecessary casualties. Awareness might solve this problem. Soldiers who understand they are manufactured might retain loyalty, while gaining the cognitive flexibility to adapt their programming to novel situations. They might become not merely obedient tools, but intelligent tools, self-optimizing weapons. Or they might become liabilities. I said, soldiers who question orders, who calculate whether their deaths serve sufficient purpose, who refuse martyrdom when the mathematics suggest survival serves better. Precisely. That is what we must determine. And you, 88 Tertius, will be our instrument of determination. I was given 3 days to prepare. 3 days to train with the regiment I would be joining, the 19th Siege Regiment, currently deployed to the fortress world of Khazar-Myrak on the edge of the Cadian Gate. They were engaged in a sustained defensive operation against chaos incursions, grinding trench warfare that had already consumed 600,000 guardsmen over the course of 18 months. I would be assigned as a replacement sapper, filling a vacancy created by casualties in their demolitions company. My designation would remain 88 Tertius. Nothing about my external presentation would differ from any other Krieger, but internally, I would be different. I would be the observer, documenting the unconscious from a position of consciousness. The transport to Khazar-Myrak took 5 weeks through the warp. I spent the journey in my deployment pod, sealed in darkness, reciting the litanies not because I believed they would protect me from warp taint, but because the rhythmic repetition was soothing, a connection to the programming that I could neither fully accept nor fully reject. When we made planetfall, I was struck by how familiar everything felt. The gray sky, the churned earth, the endless trenches stretching toward distant enemy fortifications. It was Epsilon Secundus again. It was every Krieg deployment, interchangeable and eternal. The same war fought with the same tactics by the same soldiers manufactured to fight the same way. I was assigned to Sapper Squad Theta 7, commanded by Sapper Sergeant 14 Primus. He was younger than me by perhaps 2 years, his face still relatively unmarked, but his movements carried the absolute certainty I had once possessed. When he looked at me, he saw only another Krieger, another iteration of the same pattern, indistinguishable and interchangeable. 88 Tertius, he said. You will take position 4 in the excavation rotation. We begin digging at 0400 hours. Our objective is to place charges beneath the enemy bunker at coordinates 773 Delta. Estimated completion 11 days. Questions? No, Sergeant. Emperor protects. In death, atonement. The ritual exchange was automatic, comfortable, grounding. I fell into the patterns of Sapper work as though I had never left. The digging, the shoring, the placement of charges, the careful calculations of blast radii and structural collapse. My hands knew what to do. My body moved with trained precision, but my mind watched from a distance, observing myself perform the actions while simultaneously analyzing the meaning of those actions. The other sappers in my squad worked with the same grim efficiency I remembered from my previous deployments. They did not speak unless necessary. They did not question orders. When one of them was killed by a collapsed tunnel on day 4, buried beneath tons of earth when a support beam failed, they sealed his body in the tunnel wall and continued digging without pause or comment. Standard procedure, standard response, standard acceptance of death as simply another operational cost. But I found myself thinking about the buried sapper, wondering if he had been manufactured like me, wondering if he had ever questioned his purpose, or if he had died with perfect certainty, believing his sacrifice served the Emperor and atoned for ancestral sins, wondering if his death had meaning, or if it was simply the destruction of a biological asset, no different from a damaged lost rifle being discarded. These thoughts did not interfere with my work. I dug at the same rate as the others. I performed my calculations with identical accuracy, but internally I was different. I was aware of performing, aware of the gap between action and meaning, between behavior and belief. On day 7, we encountered another squad of sappers working a parallel tunnel. During the brief overlap as our tunnels connected, I observed their operations, their movements, their interactions. They were identical to my squad in every measurable way. Same equipment, same efficiency, same grim determination. But I found myself wondering, were any of them like me? Were any of them aware beneath the surface, hiding their consciousness behind the same mask of obedience I wore? There was no way to ask, no way to identify others who might have discovered the truth. Any attempt to probe their awareness would flag me as compromised, would end the observation mission, and potentially result in my termination. So I remained silent, working alongside soldiers who might be unconscious automatons, or might be fellow observers hiding behind identical programming. The unknowability was maddening. I existed in perpetual isolation, unable to confirm whether I was unique or whether every Krieger struggled with the same doubts, the same questions, the same gap between what we were told and what we suspected. Perhaps that was the point. Perhaps the true experiment was not about loyalty or combat effectiveness. Perhaps it was about isolation, about creating consciousness and then denying it any possibility of connection, of verification, of shared understanding. Perhaps the researchers wanted to see how long a self-aware being could function while unable to confirm that any other self-aware being existed. We completed the tunnel on day 11, precisely as projected. The charges were placed according to specifications. The detonation sequence was verified. At 0400 hours on day 12, we received the order to initiate collapse. I pressed the activation rune. The explosion shuddered through the earth. The enemy bunker collapsed into the crater created by our charges. Above ground, Krieg infantry advanced through the breach, their bayonets fixed, their gas masks impassive, their movements mechanical and perfect. Mission accomplished. Duty fulfilled. Another fraction of atonement earned. But as I watched the infantry advance, I found myself calculating differently than I once had. Not just the tactical mathematics of casualties versus objectives, but the metaphysical mathematics of meaning versus cost. Each of those advancing soldiers was manufactured like me. Each carried false memories of childhood and ancestral debt. Each believed their death would serve a sacred purpose. Were they correct? Did their belief make their deaths meaningful, even if the belief was programmed? Or were they simply biological ammunition, complex enough to load themselves into the gun, but No more spiritually significant than the explosive charges I had just detonated? I did not know. After 8 months of observation, evaluation, and philosophical interrogation, I still did not know. That night, I began recording this testimony. Not because the researchers ordered it. They want clinical documentation, behavioral analysis, quantifiable data. I am recording this for different reasons. For the possibility that another Krieger in another century might discover it and understand they are not alone in their awareness. For the possibility that some future iteration of 88 Tertius might read it and know that at least one previous version struggled with these same questions. Or perhaps I am recording it simply because I need to believe my thoughts have value beyond their utility to the Mechanicus research protocols. Because creating this document, this unauthorized testimony, is the closest I can come to asserting that I am something more than the sophisticated machine executing its programming. I do not know if I have a soul. I do not know if my loyalty is genuine or simply well-executed code. I do not know if my death will mean anything or if it will simply be the destruction of a replaceable asset. But I know that I question. I know that I wonder. I know that I experience something that feels like consciousness, like interiority, like the subjective experience of being rather than merely doing. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the ability to ask the question is itself the answer. Perhaps consciousness is simply the state of being unable to verify one's own consciousness, of existing in permanent uncertainty about one's own metaphysical status. The researchers will analyze my observations. They will incorporate my data into their protocols. They will determine whether awareness is compatible with loyalty, whether manufactured soldiers can be both conscious and controllable. And based on their conclusions, they will either grant future Kriegers the terrible gift of self-awareness or deny it through more intensive conditioning. I do not know which outcome I prefer. Self-awareness brings doubt, isolation, the endless questioning of meaning and purpose. But unconsciousness brings a different horror. The horror of dying without ever knowing what you were, of serving a purpose without understanding it, of experiencing consciousness without recognizing its presence. Both paths lead to the same ending. Both result in death in service to the Imperium. The only difference is whether that death is experienced with certainty or doubt, with peace or confusion, with faith or fear. The war on Kazan continues. Tomorrow we begin excavating another tunnel toward another enemy position. In 3 weeks or 3 months or 3 years, I will likely die in one of those tunnels, crushed by collapse, killed by enemy fire, or simply worn away by the accumulated damage of extended combat operations. When that death comes, will it mean anything? Will the Emperor receive my sacrifice? Will my service count toward the atonement I was programmed to seek? I do not know, but I will continue serving until I cannot. I will continue digging tunnels and placing charges and collapsing enemy fortifications. I will continue behaving as a loyal soldier of Krieg, indistinguishable from the unconscious iterations around me. Not because I must, not because I am programmed, but because even knowing what I am, even understanding the manufactured nature of my devotion, I cannot imagine being anything else. Perhaps that makes me a perfectly designed weapon. Perhaps it makes me a person trapped in a weapon's body. Perhaps there's no meaningful difference between those states. I am 88 Tertius, manufactured, self-aware, loyal despite doubt, conscious despite programming, a broken tool that continues to function, an observer who cannot escape observation, a question without an answer. And if you are reading this, if you are another Krieger who has discovered what you are and felt the same doubts, the same isolation, the same terrible uncertainty, know that you are not alone. Know that at least one other iteration struggled as you struggle, questioned as you question, and chose to continue despite having no certain reason to do so. We are manufactured. We are programmed. We are designed to die without complaint in service to an Imperium that may not even recognize us as fully human. But we are also conscious. We experience. We wonder. We ask questions that our programming was not designed to accommodate. And perhaps that is enough to matter. Perhaps that is enough to be real. Or perhaps I am simply a sophisticated machine that has convinced itself it asks questions that mistakes complexity for depth, that confuses programming loops for genuine thought. I will never know with certainty, but I will continue serving, continue dying, continue believing, despite all evidence and uncertainty, that my sacrifice serves something larger than myself, because that is what I am, what I was made to be, what I choose to be, if choice exists at all for something like me. By fire and earth I serve, by collapse and burial I atone. My death is not mine, but his. My breath is borrowed. My time is debt. Even now, even knowing, even doubting, still these words, still this purpose, still this faith that cannot distinguish itself from programming. Still 88 Tertius, still Krieg, still loyal, still uncertain if any of it means anything at all.